Sorry.
Dear student friends and respected listeners, in the last sitting, you remember we have dealt with two poems. Both the poems were written by one poet, Tennyson, and both the poems have the same thematic background, but they express different moods responding to the same mental setup. Now, our main purpose is to see how poetic moods are innumerable and uncountable. Literature is used in a very common sense, but remember, it is only in abstraction that literature is discussed. Ultimately, literature consists of different pieces of poems, different novels, different plays. All these together are designated as literature. But when we come to study literature, actually, it deals with individual poems. After reading many poems, one comes to know what poetry is. If we know how to read a poem, if we know how to study, understand, and interpret a poem, then we have crossed the first step in the study of literature in general. Remember, whenever we study individual poems and then try to understand the nature of poetry, we are always on a firm ground. But if we start with abstract definitions and then study poems, we are in a disadvantageous position. Remember, previously, in the olden days, every study used to start with definitions. But with the advent of the modern era, things have changed, and all scholars and critics have felt that the study should not start with definitions but with studying actual concrete illustrations. I remember Elizabeth Drew's poetry starts with the same fashion, whereas Hudson, in his Introduction to the Study of English Literature, starts with definitions. Introduction of William Henry Hudson is a very great book. But for the beginners, it creates a lot of confusion because while dealing with the nature of poetry, he gives us many definitions of many great persons. And after all those things, he comes to discuss the forms of literature, whereas in the book of Elizabeth Drew, she provides many small poems and big poems and then tries to deduct the important qualities of poetry, and the definition is derived by slow and gradual exposition of poetic nature in various poems. Now, in this study also, I propose to study single poems And we don't have so much of time to study and analyze hundreds and hundreds of poems. That is not possible. But at least some important modes and models of English poetry, because of which we shall have some experience of poetic expression in its various forms. After our attempt in studying two poems of the same poet, now let us try to read two very great poems written by very great poets on the same theme. When I talk about two important poems or two great poems by two great writers on the same theme, I remember a very interesting analysis made by Elizabeth Drew. She gave us a comparative study between Keats' sonnet on looking at on looking at Chapman's Homer. Keats and Cowden Clarke got the copy of Chapman's Homer from a library, and both of them together sat and read the poem. By morning, they completed it, and Cowden Clarke went home. The next day morning, it is said that Keats left that famous sonnet on looking at Chapman's Homer and the copy itself. Whereas, after some time, Cowden Clarke also gave us a description of their experience studying first looking at Chapman's Homer. It's a very interesting study of comparison. How the really felt joy finds itself in two forms of literature. One wrote a famous sonnet, and Cowden Clarke left us a prosaic description of their experience. In the same way, in the present poems we are going to study, the theme is almost similar. Both have a common background. Those two poets are, one is Herbert of 17th century and the other is Hopkins of 20th century. We all have read or at least heard the poem named The Collar by Herbert. Similarly, we also may have heard the poem of Hopkins, Thou art just indeed Millard. The similar background shared by these two poets is the religious faith. Both are in the profession of church and both have been very devotional to their God and faith. In Collar, Herbert says that he is dissatisfied or discontented with the present state of things. He has been serving his Lord for a very long time, and he has not, as he alleges, received rewards as others received them. So, he is tired, he is very much exhausted, and to some extent angry against his own Lord. And he writes this poem with a sudden start. I struck the board and cried no more. The sentence is a classic example of expressing our dissatisfaction. I have been serving for a very long time, and I have been obedient and sincere, and I never diverted myself from my faith or belief in my Lord, and yet I am not provided with whatever I wanted. That is the theme of the first lines. He waited for a very long time. Now he is not going to wait. He says, I struck the board and cried, no more. And he adds the decision he has taken for the present. He says, I will abroad. He wants to go away from that particular place. He wants to leave that particular master. And he would like to search for his food elsewhere, because the world is very wide and he has strong hands and he can go and employ himself somewhere where he proposes, he hopes to get something better than what he is getting here. And the poem continues with the same. There are very interesting images, there are very interesting metaphors and similes. With all these things, the poem echoes his religious faith, because almost all the metaphors, almost the whole symbolism is derived from his biblical faith. Actually, the poem proceeds on two levels. One level is that of mundane or worldly one, and the second one is the spiritual one. Actually, the outside symbolism is that of a master and a servant. The servant is very sincere and obedient in his duties, and the owner or the master is negligent towards his servant. And on the other level, the poet appears to be a devoted believer in God, and the God, as usual, does not pay much attention to his beloved devotees. And the symbolism on its exterior shows that he is tired and he wants to leave, and his dissatisfaction to some extent changes into a kind of indignation and anger, and the anger grows with every line. You can see the lines. Have I no harvest but a thorn, to let me bleed and not restore what I have lost with cordial fruit? He says he had lost everything, but he is not in a position to revive anything. He is trying his level best, but it appears that his Lord is not careful enough to give him whatever he wants. Then he goes on to say, sure, there was wine before my sighs did ride, there was corn before my tears did throne. There was a time when he was in plenty and he also had a satisfactory life. But after two events, he lost everything, and now he is craving for something to his satisfaction. The poem continues like that. Away, take heed, I'll abroad. Please remember, I don't want to continue here. I am going abroad. Calling thy head here, tie up thy fears. He that forbears the fruit and for his need deserves his load. The poem continues, and then comes the last 4 lines. And these 4 lines are a kind of climax, not only for his dissatisfaction and decision, but also a kind of spiritual transformation. I read the lines, I quote, but that is the most important thing. In spite of my anger, in spite of my dissatisfaction, in spite of my raving and raging, okay, but as I raved and grieved more fierce and wild at every word, I was growing fierce and my anger is increasing by every word. And during this particular process, I heard one calling. He heard something like a calling. And in that call is methought I heard one calling, child, and I replied, my Lord. In the 4 lines, especially in the last 2 lines, the flow and the words and the force are suddenly softened. And they are softened to such an extent that the whole anger turns into a kind of surrender, and the last surrender is sudden and complete. See that? And I replied, the particular calling, child, has changed the poet's mood, and involuntarily or instinctively he replied. He said, my Lord. Friends, while reading this particular poem, you can very easily visualize the living man, the living servant, standing there in the beginning with all anger and just going on expressing his anger, and ultimately when he hears that particular word, child, he surrenders and instinctively replies, my Lord. It is Christian symbolism, no doubt, and every line carries the spiritual spirit of the Christian, and even the metaphors, even the events that are described or that are remembered in the poem are Christian. But one thing is definite. A poem has a tremendous tension between the poet's depth of belief and his worldly dissatisfaction and anger on the one side. Not only that, the last word appears to be a kind of instinctive surrender. He yields. He forgets all his anger. As if the hand of the Lord is on his shoulder, and as usual, he surrenders to that without any reservation. There is a kind of metaphysical contrast, but it clearly gives us an idea as to how a rational devotee of Christianity becomes anger at looking at the defects of the world, but whenever he hears the voice, child, he involuntarily surrenders himself and with a great submission says, my Lord. So, the poem Caller of Herbert is to be read with some other poems written by Herbert. Because the poem gets more light, especially when we read the poems like Puli or One Song. In another poem, Herbert clearly says that he was dissatisfied with a small piece of land which was given to him. He was not getting any yield. The land proves to be unfruitful. So he wants to complain and he goes to heaven to his divine father to make a complaint. He goes there, but he was told that God has gone to the earth in relation to some piece of land. So the poet comes back to the earth and he knows where his Lord stays whenever he visits the earth. So he goes there and finds him sitting with poor people. As soon as the poet goes there, the Lord looks at him and he immediately gestures with his hand and tells him to go away because that particular problem is solved. In one more poem, Puli especially, discontentment is the most important theme. God has given practically every virtue, but he holds contentment because he says if contentment is given, he forgets his divine law. So with all these poems, if you read this poem, discontentment is temporary, but yet it is there. Discontentment can be erased with his deep faith and divine call. It's a very interesting poem. The same idea of discontentment and the same sense of belief and faith is reflected in this poem also, written by Hopkins, Thou art just indeed, my Lord. There are similarities. Let us see this way. Thou art indeed just, Lord. Yes, my Lord. You are great. You are just. Whatever you do is justified and correct. If I contend with thee, I accept that whatever you do is just, and yet, what happens if I question? Yes, if you take the first two lines of Herbert's poem, the theme is the same thing. Yes, I have been here. I have been with you. I served with you. But what else? I would like to question. What have you done? You see, thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee. But, sir, again there is a but. But, sir, so what I plead is just. If you have done something just, or whatever you have done is just, I think what I plead also is just. It is a rationalist devotee. Here is a man who wants the religious faith to be consumed with a pinch of rational faculty. That is why he wants to question. Actually, questioning is not the word. He says, plead. I would like to plead a particular argument. Why do sinners' ways prosper? The first question is, O Lord, you say that it is a garden of heaven. You say that we are all devotees. The faith towards God is a must. Okay, I spent the life of a great virtuous man. I followed all the principles of the Bible. I was always with you and I did not remember anything else. In spite of this fact, I observe in this world, those who do not do anything, those are sinners, they are prospering. We remember Shakespeare's line, some rise by sin, some fall by virtue. And why must disappointment all I endeavor end? Yes, he has used this word disappointment, which we were discussing in the poem of Herbert also. We said discontentment, and here it is disappointment. I have been attempting, I have been trying, I have been working with so much of sincerity, and yet what I harvest is disappointment only. Are you my enemy? Oh, thou my friend. Again, we find there is a kind of metaphysical tension. On one side, said, are you my enemy, oh my friend? How does the verse, what else, what more verse can you do to me? I wonder, then thou dost defeat and thwart me. You are defeating my purposes. You are deserting me when I am in need. And you are not giving me the harvest in spite of my hard labor, etc. Are you my enemy? No, you are my friend. And yet you do this. Oh, the sarts and thralls of lust, do in spare hours more thrive than that either spend, sir, life upon thy cause. In these two lines, Hopkins reminds us of Milton. The complaint is that fellows who commit sins, who are corrupt in their nature, and who have entered Christianity with vile motives of extortion of money, they are prospering. We remember Milton again when he says that church has become a fertile ground for all corrupt people to make their careers. Are you doing that? They are remembering God only in their spare hours, whereas in the majority of time they are after money and material comforts. Those people are prospering like anything, whereas I spend my whole lifetime only in your service, God, and yet I am not prospering. See, banks and breaks now lived how thick. It's a very interesting sentence, very powerful sentence, and a great metaphor. Sometimes we get that idea. See, when it rains, all trees and plants that are of no use grow very flashy and they go green, whereas the real useful plants do not grow with so much of speed. If you are walking on a street, you just see on both sides, after rains, these trees go on growing flashy and grow greener by day. Now, leaved, how thick, they are getting more and more leaves, and those leaves also not thin but thick. Laced they are again with fretty shivering. Look, and fresh wind shakes them. Birds build. Friends, this is what poetry is. Hopkins is trying to compare his starved life in spite of his belief with every other thing in this world. He thinks that all plants that are of no use are getting more and more greener, are getting more and more leaves. And a tree like chevrolet, you see that it is getting not only greener and greener, but it is dancing in the wind as if it has got everything in this world. Whereas the birds are there, after rains they also build. But see me, my miserable condition. I am not building. I cannot build. I am not getting any new leaves. I am dried up as I have been. No, but strain time's eunuch. I do my efforts, but I am impotent, made by time. I cannot produce anything. and not breed. I don't even produce anything that is necessary, one birth that wakes. I am not in a position to achieve anything which is memorable on this earth. Mine, O thou Lord of life. See that, my life. O Lord, you are the Lord of my life. Mine, send my roots rain. It is a typical Hopkins style, elliptical. My life is absolutely dry. Oh my God, send some rain to my roots. Whereas others are getting water, and their roots are flourishing, and they are growing greener and greener, and they are getting more and more leaves. Milord, my life has been a dry one. Now, you send water to my roots also. You are doing many things, Lord, and they are just, but what about my injustice? Why don't you repair it? Why don't you make me? Friends, Hopkins is a great poet. We call him a great poet, and we must call him a great poet. Why? You see the experience and you see the expression. It is such a forceful expression, and with all his ability to elliptical language, and with all his capacity to use words according to his plan and his wishes, he puts whatever he wants to, that discontentment and disappointment of life. It is a great poem. Now, if you want to compare these two poems, both are steeped in religious faith, but both are discontented and dissatisfied with what they get. And remember, the complaint is only exterior, superficial, because ultimately their belief in God is more strong, more continuing, more serious than their questioning. Yes, question they do, but the questioning is a quality of their rational life, but on the spiritual line, they observe, they study, and they raise doubts, and the doubts are raised by every rational being. But ultimately, in spite of their efforts to sincere questioning, again they submit only with a pleading, and that is, their Lord must send more water. Theme is the same, friends. But these two poems have a very peculiar background. It does not mean that such phenomenon does not exist in other religions and in other countries, but it existed in England more. Why? Because the Roman Catholic Church had a great sway over Europe and in England also, and later on in 14th century, it succumbed to a tremendous sense of corruption. And that corruption in Catholic Church became a kind of disease, as a result of which many countries, European countries, developed tremendous dissatisfaction with it. And then, to their religious rescue, the Reformation had taken place, and after Reformation, some nations, including England, got a new religion and hence a new God. All their dissatisfaction, all their discontentment has a kind of background that corruption has steeped into Catholic Church. They do hope that after Protestant church they would get more help, more hope, but they were not satisfied with it. Their hopes were not fulfilled. Both the poets have that. In case of Herbert, there was a clear-cut schism, but Hopkins also had the same. By reading these two poems, we not only read the poet's heart, the poet's emotions regarding religious belief, but they give us an historical idea how Christianity developed and how religious faith became a problematic issue for many, right from Wycliffe right up to Hopkins.